Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the U.S. Emergency Response. Hurricane Katrina formed August 23, 2005, and in less than a week grew from a tropical depression to a Category 5 hurricane. Introduction: Hurricane Katrina. Early morning, Monday, August 29th, Katrina made landfall, weakening to a Category 3 from a Category 5, packing winds of 125 miles per hour. A massive 26-foot storm surge slammed into the coastal cities of Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, wiping out to sea everything in its path. New Orleans was not directly hit by Katrina, and officials believed they had, quote, dodged a bullet. However, in a few short hours, New Orleans would know the real threat. Floodwaters up to 26 feet high would destroy homes, businesses, and lives. New Orleans background. New Orleans, Louisiana was established in 1718 by the French, later bought by the United States in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. New Orleans, on the Mississippi River, was one of the most important shipping routes of the time. Thousands of slaves were sold in markets, while its free African American community thrived. At the start of the Civil War, New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederacy, but it was only a year until Union troops took the city unopposed. During the Reconstruction era, race became a powerful political force, as emancipated slaves and free people of color were brought into the political process. However, with the rise of the White League and the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, they were forced back out of it. By the 20th century, New Orleans streetcars were electrified, and New Orleans jazz was born in its club and dance halls. The city grew. New pump technology drained the low-lying swampland. This meant many residents could live below sea level. After World War II, suburbanization and conflicts of school integration drew white residents out of the city, leaving a core that was increasingly African American and impoverished. New Orleans' key struggles in the last 100 years have been social, poverty and racial strife, and natural, hurricanes, floods, and slowly sinking land. Preparation and mitigation before Katrina. In June 2004, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, conducted the Hurricane Pam drill, a simulation of a Katrina-like hurricane hitting New Orleans. The results were complete devastation. The levee system, built by the Army Corps of Engineers, was supposed to prevent the city from flooding by a fast-moving Category 3 hurricane. The Mississippi levees were strong. However, Lake Pontchartrain's levees were not as reliable, and officials were worried a short-term flood was possible. Neighborhoods with the city's poorest, most vulnerable, with houses below sea level, were at greatest risk. Friday, August 26, the governor of Louisiana declared a state of emergency and asked President Bush to do the same. The president complied, triggering FEMA to organize and mobilize its resources for their emergency response after the storm. Saturday, August 27th, the mayor of New Orleans issued a voluntary evacuation order, which he made mandatory the very next day, Sunday, August 28th, one day before Katrina was to make landfall. For those who could not leave the city, the mayor declared the New Orleans Superdome the shelter of last resort. That evening, 80% of the city's residents evacuated, leaving roughly 25,000 in the Superdome and tens of thousands in their homes to ride out the storm. Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans. Although Hurricane Katrina weakened to a strong Category 3 when hitting land in the early morning hours of August 29, 2005, it was still packing winds of 125 miles per hour, stretching some 400 miles across, with a storm surge of 26 feet, wiping out everything in its path along the Gulf Coast regions in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. New Orleans sustained damages, but missed a direct hit, leaving the city officials relieved, but that relief was short-lived. The levees were weakened by the storm surge and continuous rain. Water began to seep through the soil underneath levees, while others were swept away. Once the levees were overwhelmed, water flowed over top. Low-lying neighborhoods by 9 a.m. that morning were under so much water, residents had to climb up to their attics or rooftops to stay out of the rising water. FEMA was activated but was very slow to respond. It took days before their operations were up and running. President Bush and the federal government were unprepared, and FEMA was just not up to the job. Meanwhile, at the Superdome, Katrina victims were running out of supplies. People were desperate. Some would break into shops and stores and steal food for their families to survive. Lawlessness reigned, and eventually President Bush sent in the National Guard to restore order. There were some heroes. The Coast Guard evacuated approximately 34,000 people, and many ordinary citizens commandeered boats, offered food and shelter, and did whatever else they could to help their neighbors. Recovery and reconstruction. 80% of all structures in New Orleans sustained water damage. Over 2,400 homes were damaged or destroyed. As of August 2016, there has been $120.5 billion in federal spending. The majority, $75 billion, went to emergency relief, not rebuilding. Philanthropic giving was only $6.5 billion, and private insurance claims $30 billion. New Orleans still has not returned to its pre-Katrina city. Much more is needed. Lessons learned. Katrina exposed deep poverty in New Orleans. More than 1 million people were evacuated from the region, and Katrina displaced more people than any other event since the Dust Bowl drought and dust storms of the 1930s. A failure of initiative. Final report of the Select Bipartisan Committee to investigate the preparation for and response to Hurricane Katrina. I have emboldened the most critical. Levees protecting New Orleans were not built for the most severe hurricanes. The failure of complete evacuations. The critical elements of the National Response Plan were executed late, ineffectively, or not at all. DHS and the states were not prepared. Massive communications damage and a failure to adequately plan for alternatives impaired response efforts. Command and control was impaired. The collapse of local law enforcement and lack of effective public communications led to civil unrest. Medical care and evacuation suffered from a lack of advanced preparations and adequate communications. Long-standing weaknesses and the magnitude of the disaster. FEMA logistics and contracting systems did not support a targeted, massive, and sustained provision of commodities. The head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Margaret Wallstrom, said, "Hurricane Katrina has taught us that disaster risk reduction must be people-centered and engage all sectors of society." Thank you.